Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 18. The Rise of Khrushchev, 1953 to 1958, Part 7, C. This was reflected in numerous economic and commercial agreements, which set up conditions of commercial exchange and joint-owned public corporations able to milk the satellite countries for Russia's benefit. Some of this was based on reparations. As example of this exploitation, we might mention that the joint corporations in East Germany drained from that area goods worth 1 billion Reichsmarks a year in terms of 1936 prices in the 1946 to 1948 period. The Soviet-Polish Coal Agreement of 1945 bound Poland to sell coal to Russia at 1/10 the price obtainable elsewhere. In all, it has been estimated that the Soviet Union extracted goods worth $20 billion out of Eastern Europe in 1945 to 1946. By 1952, Eastern Europe, with the notable exception of Yugoslavia, was being organized as a colony of the Soviet Union along Stalinist lines. The bitter attacks on Tito arose from Tito's refusal to accept this and from the challenge which the existence of his different system afforded to Stalin's control. Tito was able to resist because he was outside the zone of Soviet military occupation and had built up a military and bureaucratic hierarchy loyal to him, while inside that zone these hierarchies had been constructed under Soviet guidance and were loyal to Stalin rather than to the local leaders. The one exception, Albania, sided with Stalin because it feared Yugoslavia, just as Tito feared the Soviet Union. As a too powerful neighbor, in 1951 to 1952, the incipient purge in the Soviet Union was extended to the satellites, where its anti-Semitic overtones were even more evident. Rudolf Salansky, leader of the Czech Communist Party, was tried and executed in spite of his abject subservience to Stalin, while Anna Pauker was removed from her offices in Romania. This drove Tito closer to the Western camp and led Tito's friends, Milovan Dilas, to recognize that the problem of Stalinism was not personal but institutional, caused by the structure of the system, a disease fatal to any real social welfare. He called this disease bureaucratic degeneration. When Dilas went further at the end of 1953 and recognized that the real issue was between freedom and absolutism, a choice for all the zone between the West and the East, he broke with Tito because his criticism clearly applied to Tito's authoritarian bureaucracy as well. Many persons in the satellites, even the young, who had lifelong indoctrination in the authoritarian outlook, reached similar conclusions and were like tinder to any anti-Soviet spark. The sparks were provided by Khrushchev, with his continued curtailment of the secret police, his acceptance of Titoism, and, above all, his secret speech. Few recognized that Khrushchev was basically an ultra-Stalinist himself, fully committed to foreign aggression, to ultra-industrialization, and to ruthless discipline of the working masses, especially the peasants. His tactical shifts were taken as indicators of a moderate personality, while in fact Khrushchev was as extreme as Stalin and more reckless. As part of the thaw in Eastern Europe, there was a considerable shift from Stalinism. Hundreds of thousands of political prisoners were either released or given reduced sentences, and party leaders who had been purged were restored to the party. Some who had been executed were posthumously rehabilitated. That key indicator pressure to build up collective farms was reversed. In Hungary, in a single year, May 1953 to May 1954, the acreage under collective farming decreased 1/3, while the number of peasants on such farms fell 45%. This was fairly typical of the zone as a whole. This general shift undoubtedly encouraged resistance to Soviet domination, a feeling which was greatly increased in 1956 by three other factors. 1. The growing impoverishment of the zone from Soviet exploitation, from the poor crops and food shortages of 1956, and from the equally grave fuel shortages, both coal and petroleum. 2. The shift of Soviet attention from Europe to Asia. 3. The unexpected reaction to the secret speech. The consequences of these disturbing influences were general in the zone, but the specific cases of Poland and Hungary hold great interest because they worked in such totally different ways. The chief difference, of course, was the great strength of the Polish leaders and people going back to their terrible experiences at the hands of both Russians and Germans, and their memories of the extraordinary feats of the underground resistance. Soviet reactions to Polish demands for liberalizing the regime were undoubtedly influenced by a reluctance to meet that resistance again. However, the chief difference lay in the related fact that the leaders of the Polish Communist Party led the demand for liberalization and maintained a united front while doing so, while the Hungary movement was resisted by the party leaders and could be split by personal ambitions. The crisis began in both countries in the last week of June 1956. A stoppage of work at the Polish railway factory in Poznan grew into a mass demonstration against the communist regime. Shots were fired, and eventually over 50 were killed, and 323 arrested. Polish Party Secretary Ochab made concessions to the opposition and attributed the episode to social roots, the existence of serious disturbances between the party and the various sections of the working class. This was rejected 3 days later by Bulganin during a sudden and unexpected visit of the Kremlin leaders to Warsaw. Their version attributed the troubles to foreign capitalist agitators. Ochab continued his concessions and, on August 4th, readmitted to the party the popular Władysław Gomulka, a strong nationalist communist who had been removed and imprisoned at Stalin's orders in 1951. Because the continued worsening of economic conditions in the late summer of 1956 made it impossible for the Polish communists to offer the people any substantial economic concessions, they continued the political relaxation which alarmed the Kremlin. The trials of those arrested in the June disturbances were fair and punishments lenient, amid growing nationalist enthusiasm. On October 15th, Moscow learned of a Polish decision to convene the Polish Central Committee on October 18th to elect a new Politburo, which would not include Soviet Marshal K.K. Rokossowski, defense minister of Poland since the days of Stalin, and would make Gomulka party secretary. After a hurried meeting of the Soviet Presidium on October 18th, Soviet troops and naval contingents began to converge on Poland, and Khrushchev, Molotov, Kaganovich, and Mikoyan burst into the Polish Central Committee session of October 19th, just as it began. The presence of that rigid Stalinist Molotov, who had been dismissed as foreign secretary in June, was significant of the precarious decline of Khrushchev's position in the Kremlin. Khrushchev, however, acted as Soviet spokesman at the session in the Belvedere Palace. He was violent and bellicose, calling Gomulka a traitor and threatening dire consequences if the old Politburo, including Rokossovski, was not reinstated. Ochab, still Polish secretary, was firm and ordered the immediate halt of Soviet troop advances, or all negotiations would be ended and the Poles would take the consequences. This meant resistance to the Russians by the tough, well-armed Polish Secretary Corps. Khrushchev stopped his troop movements, the Russians withdrew, and the session of the Polish Central Committee finished its work, electing a new non-Soviet Politburo, which excluded Rokossovski and made Gomulka secretary. The latter, in the course of the discussions with Khrushchev, had indicated that his liberalization would extend only to domestic affairs and would not injure Polish-Soviet friendship or the Warsaw Pact. In his speech to the committee, Gomulka sought to reconcile nationalist communism with Polish-Soviet friendship and made a severe attack on the cult of personality with its hideous atrocities under the Stalinist regime. Rokossovski resigned as defense minister and returned to Russia with more than 30 other Soviet high military officers in November. Khrushchev publicly yielded in the Polish crisis on October 23rd, when he issued a statement that he saw no obstacles to relations between the two countries from the committee's actions, and that the Soviet troops would be withdrawn to their bases. On the same day, he was taking steps to crush the parallel crisis in Hungary. The troubles in the Magyar state in the summer of 1956 took the same forms as in Poland, but instead of being directed by the Communist Party secretary, they were directed against him. They appeared as agitations against the indefatigable Stalinist Matyas Rakowski and in favor of the mild Emir Nagy, who had been premier in 1953 to 1955 as Melenkov's choice and had been removed at Khrushchev's order. On July 18th, Khrushchev tried to deflate these agitations by ordering some minor reforms and replacing Rakowski as party secretary by his deputy, the uncouth and obstinate Stalinist Erno Gero. These simply intensified the agitations, which rose to a crescendo in September, chiefly from the meetings and resolutions of students, workers, and literary groups. Some of their demands were successful, including on October 19th, abolition of the compulsory study of the Russian language. On October 22nd, a meeting of about 4,000 students discussing changes in university life became diverted to political agitations and drew up 16 points, which they tried to force Radio Budapest to broadcast. Omission of some of the points, demanding a new economic policy, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, free elections, freedom of the press, and reform of the Communist Party, led to a mass demonstration on October 23rd. When Gero refused their demands, the students began to riot, smashing to pieces the huge statue of Stalin in the center of the city. The security police killed several demonstrators, but when the regular Hungarian troops were called to restore order, they joined the agitators. By that time, Soviet troops began to move from 50 miles away and arrived in the capital by 2 a.m. on October 24th. Mikoyan had preceded them. It soon became clear that the Soviet tanks could not control the situation because they could be blocked by overturned streetcars or other obstacles and could not subdue rioters in strong buildings. Mikoyan dismissed Gero and put in, as party secretary, Janos Kadar, until then a known opponent of the Stalinist group. By that time, October 25th, the revolt had spread through Hungary under the passive eyes of the Soviet troops. On the following day, Nagy, still in touch with Mikoyan, formed a new government and negotiated a ceasefire. the Russian forces withdrew from Budapest, and negotiations were opened between their officers and the Nagy government for the withdrawal from the country. By that time, the whole communist system in Hungary had collapsed. Unofficial elected groups had seized power throughout the country. The secret police and the party had disintegrated. A revolutionary council had taken control of the Hungarian army, and Colonel Paul Malater, a leader of the revolt, had been made a major general and minister of defense. Most significant of all, the one-party system had been ended, and members of the revived non-communist parties had joined the cabinet. Most significant of all, the one-party system had been ended, and members of the revived non-communist parties had joined the cabinet. On October 31st, the official Soviet news agency, TASS, announced that the Kremlin was ready to recognize the new government and negotiate withdrawal of all Soviet troops from the country. However, as October ended, large Soviet forces had begun to invade Hungary, crossing into the country on numerous temporary combat bridges. On November 1st, Kadar, who had pretended to be one of Nagy's closest supporters, fled from Budapest to the Soviet headquarters at Szolnok. There he set up a new government under Soviet control. The same day, Nagy called to the United Nations, appealing for help and announcing Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and its resumption of neutrality. In the meantime, the Soviet invasion was in full operation, overrunning the country and smashing into Budapest before dawn on November 4th. Most of the resistance was overwhelmed that day. As it collapsed, the Nagy government and their families took refuge in the Yugoslav embassy. The Yugoslavs, including Tito, were obviously confused by Kadar's change of sides and accepted his promise of safe conduct to their homes for Nagy and his associates. However, when these people left the security of the embassy on November 22nd, they were seized by Soviet forces and deported to prisons outside Hungary. By that date, the flight of refugees from Hungary was in flood, despite efforts by the Kadar government to prevent it. Many were killed as they tried to pass the frontiers, but thousands escaped to the west, where many of them were able to continue their studies in a new way of life. The costs of the uprising were catastrophic. On the Hungarian side, there were about 2,800 killed, 13,000 wounded, and 4,000 buildings destroyed. But tens of thousands were in exile or in hiding. The country was shattered and lay as a conquered country under the armed forces of its oppressor. The unanticipated consequences of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization efforts in Eastern Europe were bound to injure Khrushchev in the Kremlin power struggle. Indeed, they brought him to the brink of final disaster early in 1957. As usual, the shifts of power were indicated by changes in personnel. Kakanovich, who had been removed from the government on June 5, 1956, was restored as Minister of Building Materials on September 22nd. Shipilov, who had been Khrushchev's appointee as Foreign Minister in June, lost his other post as Secretary to the Central Committee on Christmas Day, 1956. Above all, on November 22nd, Molotov was made Minister of State Control, a post which had budgetary functions in all parts of the state-controlled economy and could have been built up into a state power in opposition to Khrushchev's party power in the economic system. Moreover, de-Stalinization ceased after July 1956, and even Khrushchev found it necessary to praise the old ogre. On December 23rd, Pravda denied that there had ever been any Stalinism in the Soviet Union. 8 days later, Khrushchev said, "We can state with contrition that we are all Stalinists, in fact." On January 17, 1957, at the Chinese embassy in Moscow, he said, "Stalinism, like Stalin himself, is inseparable from communism. In the fight against the enemies of our class, Stalin defended the cause of Marxism-Leninism." For Khrushchev, as for all the Soviet leaders, the great issue was to prevent Titoism from spreading into the Soviet Union, and if possible to curtail its spread among the satellites. Every effort was made to prevent knowledge of the Polish October and the Hungarian Revolt from reaching the Soviet people, and the attacks on Tito and Yugoslavia were resumed. Tito struck back on November 11th with the charge that Stalin had taken the domestic and foreign policies of the Soviet Union to dead ends, and that his errors were not personal ones, but intrinsic in the Soviet system of monolithic authoritarianism. He was refuted in Pravda a week later. The Hungarian invasion destroyed much of the appeal of communism to the leftists of Western Europe and the world. This had already been left in shreds by the secret speech. Even in the Soviet Union, university students and intellectuals disapproved of the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Many literary works written during the de-Stalinization phase in the spring were published the following winter, when the tide had turned again. Khrushchev struck hard at these groups and continued to do so for several years, with the result that the alienation of Russian intellectuals from Khrushchev became established. This was reflected in the expulsion from the universities later in 1956 of hundreds of students who refused to applaud the Soviet attack on Hungary. The official Soviet line was that most disturbances of this kind arose from the activities of foreign agitators, of capitalist aggressors. Simultaneously, with the Soviet political and intellectual reaction after June 1956, came a series of efforts to alienate the economic stringency. Wages were raised, taxes reduced on the poorest payers. Social benefits were extended, and the labor unions were urged to protect them. Numerous projects in heavy industry under the 5-year plan were slowed up and their resources diverted to consumer goods. Most significant of all, there was a sharp increase in the influence of state officials and a corresponding decrease in that of party officials. This reversal was fully evident in the Central Committee session of late December 1956, but the following meeting, in February 1957, showed Khrushchev in an aggressive counterattack. This took the form of suggestions for a drastic reorganization of Soviet economic life toward a more decentralized system. Undoubtedly, this plan had considerable merit, but in Khrushchev's eyes, it had an additional advantage, since it would remove much of economic life from the influence of the central state ministries and leave it open to increased influence from local party groups. He proposed the division of the Soviet Union into several dozen economic regions, each under an economic council, or Sovnarkorsi, of diverse groups, and the de-evolution of these groups, of the economic functions, of the majority of the economic ministries in Moscow. These ministries would be abolished, along with the State Commission for Current Planning, GEC, and Molotov's Ministry of State Council. This would leave only the Long-Range Economic Planning Agency, Gosplan, and a few economic ministries at the center, with annual planning and most execution left to the regional or lower groupings. This plan had real merits which can hardly be covered here. Clearly, the growing complexity of the Soviet economy over a widely diverse terrain and people could not be operated efficiently by uniform regulations from the center. Moreover, Each economic ministry, because of the constant shortages of resources, materials, and labor, sought to build up within itself its own sources of supply, and also had a constant urge to hoard equipment and parts, even when they were not needed by it, and were urgently needed by enterprises of a different ministry in the next street or district. This hampered expansion and also resulted in very expensive cross-hauling of the freight of one ministry from remote areas at the very time that a different ministry might be hauling similar resources in the opposite direction. The serious overworking of the Soviet railway system, a constant weakness in the economy, was intensified by such needless hauling. In spite of its merits, the anti-K group in the Presidium was unwilling to adopt this reform because it would drastically weaken centralized state control and strengthen localized party control in the Soviet economy. The state hierarchy of Soviets had fallen into decay, partly because of Stalin's use of the party and secret police, partly as a means to avoid use of the fraudulently democratic Soviet constitution and of its federalist features. As a consequence, the state hierarchy lacked effective or flexible control down through its levels, while the party hierarchy had these well developed. Much of the state's power locally was exercised through the economic ministries, which Khrushchev now wished to abolish. And because of his control of the party and through it, of the party press, headed by Pravda, Khrushchev could keep up a steady drum of propaganda for his economic reorganization. Every local figure was for it, and it appeared to other rival leaders as an anti-state move. Khrushchev, on the other hand, could make the opposition seem anti-party, with all the treasonable overtones Stalin had given to that expression. The Economic Reorganization Law was passed on May 10, 1957, abolishing 25 economic ministries, retaining 19, and devolving their functions to 29 regional sovnarkosi. The State Economic Commission, or GEC, was also abolished, leaving as the only central economic control the State Committee for Long-Term Planning under Yusuf Kuzmin, a Khrushchev party official, who simultaneously became first deputy prime minister of the Soviet Union. Shipilov was restored to the secretaryship of the Central Committee, which he had lost in December. These changes were pushed through by an alliance of the party, the army, and all the forces of localism, both economic and state. Khrushchev had won a great victory, which could make the party dominant in economic life. Having failed to block Khrushchev's economic plans, his rivals in the Presidium were reduced to a last resort. They had to get rid of the man himself. On June 18th, at a meeting of the Presidium, the motion was made to remove Khrushchev as first party secretary. The discussion grew violent, with Melenkov and Molotov attacking and Khrushchev defending himself. He was accused of practicing a cult of personality of his own, of ideological aberrations, which threatened the solidarity of communism, and of economic mismanagement. It soon became clear that the vote was 7-4 against him, with Mikoyan, Garichenko, and Suslov his only supporters. He was offered the reduced position of Minister of Agriculture. Khrushchev refused to accept the result, denying that the Presidium had authority to remove a first secretary and appealing to the Central Committee. The members of this larger group joined in the discussion as they arrived. While Khrushchev's supporters sought to delay a final vote until his men could come in from their party posts in the provinces, Marshal Zhukov provided army planes to bring in the more distant and more reliable ones. The discussion became bitter, especially when Zhukov threatened to produce documentary evidence that Malenkov, Molotov, and Kaganovich had been deeply involved in the bloody purges of 1937. Madame Furtseva, who was, like Zhukov, an alternate member of the Presidium, filibustered with a speech of 6 hours. Surprisingly, Khrushchev's agent, Shipalov, spoke against him. But M.A. Suslov, the head of the security police and the most cold-blooded killer left in the Soviet Union, shifted to Khrushchev's side. Eventually, there were 309 members present, with 215 wanting the floor. Over 60 actually making speeches. When the vote was finally taken, Khrushchev's loyal supporters in the party hierarchy voted for him solidly, and his removal, already voted by the Presidium, was reversed. Khrushchev at once counterattacked. He moved and carried the expulsion from the Presidium of Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich, and Shipalov for anti-party activities. Then came the election of a new Presidium, from which Prevukin and Saburov, the two strongest supporters of a centralized, state-controlled economy, were also removed. Prevukin became an alternate member, but Saburov was dropped completely. The new Presidium had 15 full members instead of the previous 11, and 9 alternate members instead of 6. The old alternate members, Zhukov, Furtseva, L.I. Brezhnev, and N.M. Shievnik, who had supported Khrushchev, were moved up to be full members, joining the holdovers Khrushchev, Bulganin, Gerichenko, Mikoyan, Suslov, and Voroshilov, while 5 loyal agents of Khrushchev, led by Aristov and F.R. Koslov, were added. This change of July 23, 1957, was Khrushchev's most smashing personal victory and the most significant event in Russia's internal history after the death of Stalin. It led Khrushchev to a position of political power more complete, except for the ambiguous position of the army, than Stalin's had been, although it was clear that Khrushchev would never be allowed to abuse his power the way Stalin had done. Khrushchev did not rest on his oars. During the summer of 1957, he made notable concessions to the peasants, especially the ending of compulsory deliveries from the products of their personal plots, slammed down the lid on freedom of writers and artists with a strict cultural directive of August 28th, pushed vigorously both the Virgin Lands scheme and the decentralization of industry, and worked to curtail the growing autonomy of the armed forces. On October 27th, while Zhukov was in Albania, he was removed from the Ministry of Defense, and at the same time was dropped from the Central Committee because of unsatisfactory cooperation with the party's political work in the army. The next few months saw a twofold advance of party influence, on a lesser scale into the army and on a greater scale, both directly and through the intermediary of the revived trade unions, into the new regional economic councils. The final cap of Khrushchev's rise to power came in the spring of 1958, following the elections and assembly of the new Supreme Soviet on March 28th. Bulganin resigned as premier and was replaced by Khrushchev. In the autumn, Bulganin, who had cooperated so well with the new autocrat's rise to power, was expelled from the Presidium and condemned as an enemy of the party. This left Khrushchev as complete ruler of the Soviet Union, head of both state and party, as Stalin had been, but resting his power more on the latter than on the former. In the 5 years following Stalin's death, military strategy in the Soviet Union underwent a major debate almost as confused as the simultaneous debate going on in the United States during Eisenhower's presidency. On the whole, the range of theories of war both strategic and tactical, was much less in the Soviet Union than in the United States, and changes have been much slower. But the basic issues were the same. The orthodox military ideas of the Russians, like everything else, had been stated by Stalin and were not allowed to change under the impact of new ideas or of new weapons until after his death. Thus, Stalin orthodoxy regarded war as a struggle between whole societies, each with its distinctive way of life, and judged that the outcome would be determined by what was called the permanently operating factors. These factors emphasized the characteristics of the society, such as industrial strength, morale, level of training, and reserve forces. Other accidental factors, such as weather, surprise, ability of individual commanders, even Napoleon, or the outcome of single battles, were regarded as of little significance. Accordingly, the Russians had no faith in lightning wars, or strategic bombing, or in new or, above all, absolute weapons. To them, victory was achieved by destruction of the enemy's armed forces, by a series of blows and conflicts over a long time, during which the permanent factors, especially the forces of industrial strength and national morale, would be decisive. They regarded attacks on the enemy's population, cities, or industry as wasted effort, except where these could be directly linked to a battle. And each battle would be determined by a balance of forces from all branches of the defense services, persistently concentrating on the enemy forces over extensive time and space. In this outlook, there was no place for the nuclear bomb, or strategic air attack, or for 24-hour wars. And accordingly, the American possession of the A-bomb was largely ignored. Protests against its use and the desire to outlaw it were undoubtedly based on the fact that it was an American monopoly. But the Russian objection to city bombing or to strategic terror of the V-2 kind as ineffective and a waste of resources was undoubtedly sincere. Soviet efforts to get the A-bomb and the H-bomb and to build up a fleet of Tu-4s were partly a desire to possess what the enemy had, partly based on a desire to deter our use of strategic air command against Russia, and partly derived from Stalin's astonishment at the damage our strategic bombers had inflicted on Berlin. But none of these had much influence on Soviet military thinking. A change in strategic thinking arose in 1954 as a consequence of a debate among Soviet military leaders over the role of surprise in military victory. The possibility of a sudden American nuclear attack on Russia from the air had to be examined. As a consequence of this dispute, the role of surprise war considerably increased, although there was no general feeling that it could be decisive or even that wars might be shortened as a result of nuclear weapons. To this day, the Soviet leaders still believe that victory will go to their country after a long war of mass forces, using a balance of all arms and weapons. But they now include in this balance of weapons nuclear arms at all stages and ranges. However, they do not believe, as many Americans do, that strategic bombing can be decisive. It is simply an additional arm added on to the older arsenal, and will be used in war against military objectives primarily because wars are fought with the military sectors of a society. As a consequence of these views, the Soviet Union has no idea of being able to achieve military victory over the United States simply because they have no method of occupying the territory of the United States at any stage in a war. They hope to defeat the United States as a society by non-violent means. Propaganda, subversion, economic collapse, and diplomatic isolation. if the rivalry with the United States comes to the violent stage, they have every hope that the Soviet Union itself will not be directly involved, but can wear the United States down by fighting through third parties, as in Korea. The Russians generally reject the idea of mutual annihilation, or the total destruction of all civilization in war, and insist that any war, however severe, will leave some remnant of the Soviet Union surviving as victor on the field. They accept the possibility of limited war in a geographical sense, but have little hope of any war limited to non-nuclear weapons, because this would be, they feel, to their advantage, and accordingly not acceptable to us. Thus, they are unlikely to use nuclear weapons first, although fully prepared to resort to them once they are used by an enemy. One confusing consequence of the Soviet discussion of the role of surprise in war was an effort to distinguish between preventative and preemptive war, because the generals, planners, and staff theorists were convinced that the West must be aggressive because of the contradictions of the capitalist economic system. They were convinced that they were in danger of a surprise attack by strategic air command. Their weakness in this aspect of war made it unlikely that their retaliatory strike would be of decisive significance. So they developed a theory of preemptive strike. This said that they would counter-surprise our surprise attack by beating us to the punch with a nuclear attack of their own. Such a preemptive strike would be justified only on the basis of conclusive evidence that we were about to launch a surprise attack, since our retaliatory strike after their preemptive strike would still be very damaging to them. The problem arises, however, as to how they can ever be sure that we are about to attack them, and, failing that, how does such a preemptive war differ from a preventative war, which the Soviet abjures because it is unnecessary to them? Soviet military thinkers have been very reluctant to accept any theories of nuclear deterrence or of limited war under an umbrella of nuclear deterrence. Since war is a struggle to the death by antithetical societies, such societies will, in war, use any weapons they have. Accordingly, the Soviet Union believes that any general war involving the United States and themselves would be a nuclear war, in which their ground forces, with tactical air support and nuclear weapons of all sizes and ranges, would fight its way over land against nuclear-armed enemies to occupy most of Europe and possibly Asia. They believe that there are three defenses against tactical nuclear weapons. 1. Dispersal of their own forces as widely as possible until the last moment before assault. 2. Contact as rapidly and as closely as possible with the enemy in order to deter the enemy from use of nuclear weapons, which would also destroy its own forces. And 3. Protection of as many of their troops as possible under cover, usually in tanks. The first two of these place great emphasis on rapid mobility of troops, and the third helps to provide this. Accordingly, the Russians anticipate the use of many, if not entirely armored forces in overrunning Europe, and very extensive use of air transport of troops, with conventional planes, gliders, and helicopters. Such mobility will allow Europe to be overrun rapidly, creating a situation which, they feel, will make a victory for the West impossible, while our strategic attack on the Soviet Union itself will be reduced and eventually ended by strong defensive measures and retaliation. However, such a war, which would jeopardize the communist way of life by threatening the Soviet Union, its only accurate embodiment, is regarded by the Soviet leaders as highly undesirable and to be avoided at almost any cost, while they, in a period of almost endless Cold War, can seek to destroy capitalist society by nonviolent means, or by local violence of third parties. This theory of nibbling the capitalist world to death is combined with a tactic which would resist capitalist imperialism by encouraging anti-colonialism. Such a change called forth on the part of the United States a defensive tactic, which shifted from Dulles' insistence that the uncommitted nations must join the West to the more moderate aim of keeping them from becoming communists. This shift in aims, in reference to the uncommitted nations, occurred both in the Soviet Union and in the United States, and is of major importance in creating the contemporary world. Stalin and Dulles saw the world largely in black and white terms. Who was not with them was obviously against them. Accordingly, the world must be either slave or free, each man applying the former adjective to his opponent's side and the more favorable latter term to his own group. They were enemies, but they agreed basically that the world must be a two-power system. This meant that each was aggressive in terms of the uncommitted nations, because each insisted these must either join his own side or be regarded and treated as an enemy. The great change which occurred in the middle 1950s was that both of the superpowers had to recognize that most of the uncommitted nations were too weak, too backward, and too independent to be forced to be either capitalist or communist. They had to be something different, something of their own. This view was forced upon the superpowers, with perhaps greater difficulty in Washington than in the Kremlin. But it was an aspect of reality which had to be recognized. From it came the acceptance of neutralism and the rise of the buffer fringe. This shift was a double one. On the one hand, it meant that the superpowers' attitudes toward the buffer fringe shifted from a basically offensive one to a basically defensive one, shifted from an effort to get them to join one's own side to an effort to keep them from joining the opponent's side. And at the same time, it marked the first beginnings of true wisdom and true hope for the world's future, and the recognition that there are more than two alternative fashions for organizing a functioning economic, social, and political system. In the long run, this recognition will be a victory for the West, for the West has always, in its real nature, recognized that reality is diverse and is pluralist, while it has been the Russian way to insist that reality is dualistic, with each extreme necessarily monistic and uniform. The acceptance of diversity and of pluralism by the inevitable failure of both capitalism and communism in the buffer fringe has forced the West to accept and apply its own, often unrecognized, traditions. Moreover, the forcing of this recognition upon both the Soviet Union and the West in respect to the buffer fringe may have the consequence, in time, of forcing each of these to accept it in of forcing each of these to accept it in respect to their internal systems. Here again, this would make a great victory for the West, because the acceptance of diversity and pluralism is part of the tradition of the West and is not acceptable to Russia, whose traditions have always been basically dualistic, seeing reality as a contrast between an unattainable ideal of perfection and a horrible, sinful morass of ordinary living, the imperfections of the latter being acceptable as a necessary consequence of the unattainability of the former, with both extremes being uniform and one. Such an acceptance will reduce the tension of the Cold War by allowing each polar superpower to develop features of a mixed system which will make them approach each other in their characteristics of organization, a development which is, of course, already apparent to any unbiased observer. The shift from dualism to pluralism and from uniformity to diversity was forced upon the Soviet Union in its most critical form by the rise of Titoism. This, of course, was chiefly evident in Europe, where conditions of industrial development make it more reasonable for the Kremlin leaders to expect the Soviet example to be followed slavishly by non-capitalist states. The same lesson should, however, have been learned even earlier, in Asia, because there it became evident to many observers that most nations were neither able nor willing to follow either the Soviet Union or the United States. This observation, however, was impossible under Stalin, because his false theories of the nature of both capitalism and imperialism made him regard the two as identical, and thus to regard colonial areas as being parts of the capitalist system. As a consequence of these intellectual errors, the Kremlin, under Stalin, was prepared to see the fringes of Asia either continuing as colonial areas or breaking away from European domination to become communist zones. But it did not see the possibility of them becoming non-communist and non-colonial independent states. This meant that where Stalin intervened in certain areas of Asia, he intervened on behalf of the microscopic communist parties and rebuffed the local native, nationalist, anti-colonialist groups. Khrushchev, as we shall see, did the opposite. Stalin's policy was quite bankrupt even before his death, and it was thus fairly easy for his successors to abandon it and to adopt a more feasible policy of communist cooperation with local anti-colonial and thus largely anti-Western forces to detach them as new, independent, but still non-communist nations from the West. The Soviet assistance to such new nations was largely economic, although the limited productivity of the Soviet Union's own economic system, especially in food, made any substantial foreign aid to neutral nations a considerable burden on the Soviet Union itself. For this reason, much of the burden of such foreign aid was pushed onto the Soviet satellite states, especially Czechoslovakia. This shift in the Soviet attitude toward neutralism was helped by Dulus's refusal to accept the existence of neutralism. His rebuffs tended to drive those areas which wanted to be neutral into the arms of Russia, because the new nations of the developing buffer fringe valued their independence above all else. The Russian acceptance of neutralism may be dated about 1954, while Dulles still felt strongly adverse to neutralism 4 or even 5 years later. This gave the Soviet Union a chronological advantage, which served in some small degree to compensate for its many disadvantages in the basic struggle to win the favor of the neutrals. While these changes were occurring, the strategic debate in the Soviet Union continued. In this subject also, the fact that the Soviet Union was straining its economic resources was of great importance. The demands of the unsuccessful Soviet agricultural program made it necessary to put more and more manpower into agriculture at the very time that the demands of the defense effort and the civilian economy and the rampant waste and inefficiency in the Soviet system were increasing the demands for manpower in industry. Moreover, the heavy casualties of the period 1928 to 1945 from purges and warfare had reduced the population figures and the birth rate to such a degree that the Soviet population figures, even in 1970, would be tens of millions below normal. The only source from which such demands for manpower could be met was in the conventionally armed units of the Soviet defense forces. As a consequence of these conditions, the Soviet defense strategy debate from 1955 onward took a form somewhat parallel to that going on in the United States. That is, some of the political leaders, including Khrushchev, began to force upon the Soviet military leaders a shift in emphasis from mass conventional forces toward greater reliance upon strategic bombers and missiles. Khrushchev's version of the Eisenhower New Look, in which the latter's bigger bang for a buck was played by a Soviet version of More Rubble for a Ruble, was adopted by Soviet Chief of Staff Marshal Sokolovsky, and less vigorously by Defense Minister Marshal Malinovsky. The former's view was stated in a widely read book, Military Strategy, published in Moscow in September 1962. But it is quite clear that the military leaders were prepared to yield slowly to Khrushchev and other political leaders. The net result seems likely to be a mixed one, somewhat similar to the similar struggle in the United States. The chief difference is that the Soviet production and wealth is so much less than that of the United States that all such critical decisions must be made within much narrower parameters. In spite of these limitations of resource and demonstrations of inexperience and lack of competence parallel to that of the United States, the impact of the superpowers was tremendous, especially in Eastern and Southern Asia and in the Near East.